So there we go. So again, when we're thinking about the problems of testing the effects of drugs on aggression, we have to keep in mind it's difficult to pull out the effects of the drugs from those environmental sort of conditions, right? And again, this is a particular problem if we're trying to do this with human studies. Okay. The other sort of problem we have with human studies is we can't, we don't have as much control. Right? In an animal study, you can grab a bunch of animals. They're all genetically the same, right? There's no difference. They've all had the same environmental background, even to the same food, right? They've had the exact same levels of light and sound in their environment. They've had the same temperature their entire life as every other rat in this study. If you've got 40 rats in this study, all 40 rats have been exposed to the exact same environmental stimuli over the course of their entire life, right? And they're all genetically the same. We're, as we can just kind of look in this room, right? Genetic variability in here is fairly high compared to like a group of experimental rats. The background, the experiences that we've had, right? We're all different ages. We've all had different sort of dietary conditions, right? We've all lived in different places, sometimes in different states, in different environments. We come from different socioeconomic backgrounds. We've had different sort of enrichment opportunities. You know, if you want to think about, for rats, a good enrichment opportunity is like a cat toy, right? They'll kind of like play with these little toys. You guys have had different enrichment opportunities over the course of your lives, right? I mean, you've had opportunities to go to museums or see things over at the Joan C. Edwards Playhouse, or maybe your parents took you to, you know, Museum of Modern Art when you were younger, or maybe last summer, you know, you took a trip to Europe or something. You know, people have different sets of experiences. Maybe last summer you took a trip to Beckley. I don't know, right? So there are different experiences that folks have as humans, and it's hard to control for that. And anytime you introduce some other variable, some other sort of condition, something that's different, you lose the ability to say 100% that the cause of the difference in behavior is one thing or the other, right? So if we're giving a handful of you some sort of substance and a handful of you a different kind of substance or no substance, and some of you are more aggressive than others, well, we can't say that that was because of the drug, right? With humans, if you do this, your sample size has to be enormous, right? I mean, your sample size has to really be, if you're doing something like this, it has to really be enormous. Animals, it doesn't. You can grab a handful of animals and you can control that. The problem is, though, it's a little more difficult to make generalizations with animals, right? All right, so I gave a rat a drug and its behavior changed in a certain way. All right, what's that do for humans?
In the human testing, would it not work if you go by like a case-by-case study individually and just do a whole bunch of them?
I mean, the problem is you have to do, in order to say, like, you know, Alexis here has said cocaine makes you aggressive, right? In order to demonstrate that cocaine makes humans aggressive, you would really need to have a very large sample size of humans, right? You'd really have to have a high number of them and administer them. Then the next problem is, we haven't even really gotten there yet, is how much cocaine did they take? Okay, was the cocaine that they took just cocaine? What was the quality? What was the sort of the strength of that dose, right? With the rats, we know 100% because we're buying that from a scientific supply shop. We've mixed that ourselves, and we've given it to the rats, right? I know how this process works. I've given rats cocaine before. That's why I know how that works. Yeah, the first research lab I worked in, we gave rats, we were looking at primarily locomotor behavior under the control of dopamine receptors, and we were also looking at social behavior. And so we gave rats, we had ecstasy, LSD, we had cocaine, I thought we had something else. But we had those drugs, and we would give them to the rats, and then we would kind of monitor their behavior over some time as they interacted with other rats, or as they sort of just ran around. And mostly number one thing they would do is kind of swim in a pool of their own urine. They would just sort of That's exactly what they would do. They would just kind of move around. But what we would do is we would give them different dopamine receptor blockers and see if that would like stop the locomotor behavior, right? The increase. Because if you give someone a stimulant like cocaine, for example, or amphetamine or something that's in that class of drugs, their activity level is going to increase, right? And that's that's something we were trying to knock out with different dopamine receptor blockers and different things. The craziest thing that we did, and probably one of the most like sort of profound and counterintuitive perhaps findings, was we gave juvenile rats ecstasy, and what we found is if you gave them ecstasy as a juvenile and then tested them as an adult for social behaviors, they actually had reduced social interactions compared to rats that had not been exposed to ecstasy. And I know, Emily, that's counterintuitive, right? Because why would you take ecstasy, or what's the sort of perceived effect of ecstasy, right? Is it some sort of increase in your sociability, right? I mean, it's the friendly drug. I don't know. So anyway, I found that a particularly interesting kind of finding. And that's the thing. You think you know things until you like try it, and then you really know things. 'Cause sometimes you just think you know things, right? Like sometimes you think you know cocaine makes you more aggressive, but until you test it, you don't know. We're going to talk about people who've already tested it, so you don't have to. So yeah, I mean, there's just a lot of variability with humans, right? We have different brain development, okay? And that's going to be a really important thing that we want to think about, is the different circuits that control aggressive behavior. And I think what I'd like to say is aggressive behaviors, right? So one of the important things to sort of keep in mind now, and we'll sort of talk about this more later, is the different types of aggressive behavior. We talked about maternal aggression. We talked about territorial aggression. We talked about instrumental versus reactive aggression. All of these, we've said, have been controlled by different brain circuits, right? And those different brain circuits can be affected differently by drugs. So that, that's something to consider. There are also just some general issues with drug studies, right? We can't give people drugs, okay? It's difficult to get people to self-report the exact nature of their drugs in a way that we would know about the animals. The animals, again, it's hard to generalize. Just because a rat's more aggressive, does that mean that a human's going to be more aggressive? What makes a rat more aggressive? Well, if it's more hyperactive, if it's moving around more, it might be more aggressive, right? Maybe the rat's having some sort of anxiety or paranoid sort of response to the drugs, and it's not actually making them aggressive. Those are nuanced things that we can ask people about. We can ask them about their subjective experiences. Humans have a much broader sort of behavioral output, right? And it's easier to tell why a human is doing something than a rat. How many of you have a pet? Anybody have a pet? Yeah. Does that pet ever make noise? Is it like a dog or a cat? Right? You have a cat, I know, Emily, right? So that cat, and it just makes some kind of noise. Why? We have no idea, right? Maybe it's hungry, so you give it some food. Maybe it's thirsty, you give it some water. Maybe it's got, something stuck somewhere, and you give it a squeeze and see what comes out. There are a variety of reasons a cat can make a noise, and you don't know why, right? You don't know that motivation behind it. That's why vets, it's kind of hit or miss sometimes, right? They're trying to guess what the problem is. Well, when I poke my cat in the ribs, it tries to bite me and it yelps. Well, I mean, why? Does it have a broken rib? Is there something going on underneath? You as a human can go in and sort of describe your situation better. So sometimes when we get the behavioral output from an animal, they have a limited number of actions they can take, right? And so just because they're taking that action doesn't mean that that's the same action a human would take. It just says that's the action that was available to them, right? So they have some sort of limit. All right. So how would you even test animal aggression in the lab? I mean, pretty easily the experimental approach is you give some rats a drug and you give some rats an injection of saline, right? Okay. But there are sort of a few things we want to think about. One of those paradigms is called the resident intruder paradigm, right? Mice in particular are very territorial. So if you have a mouse in its own cage and then you put another mouse in that cage, particularly if they're male mice, they will fight each other, right? The resident mouse sees that new mouse as the intruder, and that mouse is going to try to, attack that other mouse and get it to run away. So there are things you can measure when you're measuring aggression in animals. Particularly, we're thinking about rodents here. You can measure biting, right? You can measure sort of the latency to attack. That's a big thing, right? How quickly does one mouse behave aggressively, right? Does it take a while, or is it just immediate, right? And so that's one of the best ways that you can measure if there's actually a change in aggressive behavior, is that latency to attack. The shorter the latency to attack, the more aggressive we assume that animal is, right? So that's kind of the situation. And you can think about this, you can put this in your own situation. Let's say somebody knocks on the door of your house, right? Do you open the door and do you punch the guy in the face? Or do you open the, right? You think that's ridiculous, right? But some people might, right? I mean, some people, that's your attack latency. Like, why are you knocking on my door? I'm going to punch you in the face. But you know, sometimes you have to wait a little bit and figure out, like, well, okay, who is this? Is this an annoying door-to-door salesman? Yeah, then I'll punch him in the face once he asks me if I want a vacuum cleaner, right? So you wait a little bit. But maybe it's somebody who's bringing by, I don't know, Girl Scout cookies, right? And you think, oh, I kind of like Girl Scout cookies. I'll probably not punch this person in the face. It's also like a 12-year-old girl. So that makes a difference. So you can analyze the situation more, right? So there's some mice that'll do that, but if you hype up their aggression, their aggressive responding, they won't take that time, right? They'll just go ahead and attack, and before they get a lot of the information. So that resident intruder approach is very is used quite a bit. They also look at frog and mouse killing by rats and cats. I know, right? That's the face I made. Aspen. I was like, this is not a popular or well-used approach, but it is something that you'll see out there, right? One of the reasons this particular approach is problematic for us, how many of you remember that very first week we were in class? I know that was like probably 6 or 8 years ago. It was a long time ago. And we said that we were not actually going to consider aggressive acts from one species toward another species, right? Because we said that's predation, right? That's trying to eat something, right? And we said that's completely different. It's not aggressive when you bite down on your your Whopper, whether it's an Impossible or regular version of your choice. That's not aggressive, right? That's not an aggressive action when you're, when whoever runs the slaughterhouse is, shooting cows between the eye with air pistons or whatever they do, and then cutting off pieces of meat for you to have nice burgers. That's not what we would consider aggression, right? And so this sort of frog and mouse killing, while it does give you a different sort of behavioral output, right? Something else that you can measure, it has its own problems because, again, it's a different type of behavior, so it's a different brain circuit, right? So we're not really thinking about that. Thinking about frog and mouse killing by rats and cats. Like if you're thinking about a cat killing a mouse, that's kind of like thinking about somebody on drugs like killing a bag of Cheetos, because it's really just the cat trying to eat, right? And so that's a completely different behavior, right? Do drugs increase your food intake? That's a different question than do drugs increase the likelihood that you're going to attack someone, right? Because they're different brain circuits. And so I think it's important to keep that in mind. Sometimes there are things that we think would be a really nice sort of behavioral output. Very easy to measure if a rat kills a frog, which is a really weird thing to try to imagine. I don't know if any of you are like getting a visual of that. Yeah, right, I was working on it too. It's just, I don't know. That's like two things you never thought would fight, right? Like rats and frogs. I don't know. Anyway, whatever. So basically we're going to think more about that resident intruder paradigm. There are variations on this. There are a ton of variations, right? How long do you leave the resident in there? The intruder, they'll do a few things sometimes to the intruder as well. So one of the things they'll do is they'll look at isolated versus non-isolated animals. Mice in particular, they typically live socially, right? They live in groups. And so if you isolate them, it makes them more aggressive. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, right? Now you take a guy who started a prison riot and you put him in solitary confinement, what's the next thing he's going to do? Well, he's going to be really nice when he gets back, isn't he? No, right? It seems like I mean, I'm just thinking on the surface of this, I'm thinking like, I mean, he's probably going to be probably more aggressive, right? That's not necessarily my critique of solitary confinement in general, just an important point to think about there, right? That, isolated animals are typically more aggressive than non-isolated animals, right? And so what they'll often do is they'll isolate the resident mouse, right, by itself. They'll bring in that intruder. One of the things they'll also do with the intruder is they'll make sure it's anosmic. So this sort of the nose part here, I'm going to draw a nose. It's not a great nose. There's the guy's eyes. Maybe he's got a mustache. So they'll often bring in the intruder mouse so that it's disconnected any input it might get from pheromones, right? So we've talked about pheromones a little bit before. Smelling another male urine, pile of male urine, is going to make you aggressive because if you're a mouse, particularly because you're going to think, there's somebody else here who's going to take my territory, somebody's going to take my mates, somebody's going to take my food, somebody who might kill my offspring. I should be aggressive about that. They'll often want the intruder to be as docile as possible. And often what they'll do is they'll use specific strains of mice that are more aggressive than others. So some mice have been selectively bred so that you kind of have like a second, a group of mice who are more aggressive than others. And so they'll often use those for the resident, and then for the intruder, they will use the more docile mouse. So they will either make sure it's anosmic, or they'll often give it a benzodiazepine. So they'll actually give it a tranquilizer so that it's kind of relaxed, right? So that intruder mouse is like, I'm not aggressive, I'm not even mean or angry, I'm not even giving somebody the evil eye. Because if somebody comes into your house and they give you the evil eye, that's completely different than somebody coming into your house and like, hey, I've got gummy bears, right? So those are two completely different situations. And so we're trying to, by giving the mouse a tranquilizer, making sure it can't get hyped up by pheromones, we're making sure it's not coming in and giving the other mouse the evil eye. The other thing that's important is whether or not it has testicles. So they'll often castrate the intruder mouse, once again, to sort of reduce its aggressive behaviors, right? So they're going to kind of reduce the amount of testosterone in there. They'll also often use intact or gonadectomized mice in either as the resident or the intruder as they're testing different drugs. Particularly, they'll test this with anabolic steroids. They're testing the aggressive behavior on anabolic steroids. That's sort of an important concept there. Let's see. Other questions, other things we need to think about when we think about testing animal aggression. We are measuring this sort of from an objective standpoint, but we can really turn this, we can quantify this quite a bit, right? We can quantify this, how long did it take to attack? How many times did one mouse bite the other? How many times did it chase it more around the cage? Did it stand up and do a threat posture? There are a number of things that we can look at that are going to indicate that an animal is aggressive or not aggressive. We can measure that. We can just create a sort of a composite score, right? Over the course of 5 or 10 minutes that these two animals are interacting, let's just add up all of those and just see what the number is, right? And we can do that across conditions, and we can see some are going to be more aggressive than others. All right, so that's that's animals, right? They'll do this sometimes with monkeys, other rodents, Syrian hamsters. Primarily, though, we're thinking about rats and mice. Right. So how do you test human aggression, right? Like in the lab, how would you go about testing human aggression? There are a number of ways that we can sort of naturally observe this, right? We can just measure people's behavior as they're out doing things. But there are a few tasks that I think are kind of interesting to think about that we might give someone. The first thing is we actually should probably measure what it means to be aggressive, right? And for the purposes of what we're going to think about for the next little bit, we would say that that's some sort of response which allows you to deliver or in which you deliver some sort of negative stimulus to another person, right? That's what we're going to think of as aggressive. Because when you're in the lab, you don't really want to, you don't want to send two people out there to have a boxing match. You're not going to try to get somebody so angry at this other person in your study that they go up and they punch them, right? I mean, that doesn't seem like a good approach. How many of you have participated in a psychological study? Like most of you have, right? Did you have to punch anybody? No, right? I mean, it's probably not what we should do, right? So there are sort of three broad approaches, and there are a ton of variations on this for measuring human aggression in a laboratory setting. The first one of those is what they call the bus aggression machine. That just sounds really cool, right? If you ever get a death metal band, I think the bus aggression machine is a decent name to consider. BAM, right there. I mean, you've got that nice abbreviation. I mean, I can even draw you up a logo. Your logo could be a rat fighting a frog. See, now we're really putting together something, right? So what do you do for the bus aggression machine? Basically, you've got a participant, and they are asked to deliver a shock or select a shock that's going to be delivered when there's a wrong answer. Okay? And when there's a wrong answer from this other person who's a fake person. This other person doesn't exist, right? The other person's sort of, behind a wall somewhere, right? They're imaginary. And the participant says, okay, I'm going to dial in what I think is the appropriate shock for a wrong answer. When that other person makes a wrong answer, you press the button. The experimenter can measure how long you pressed the button and the intensity level that you chose before that wrong answer, right? And so we can think about that as some sort of aggressive thing, right? Why would you deliver? I mean, if you were in this situation, why would you deliver a higher shock to someone than required by the like the minimum level should be, right? And then you think about, well, why would you deliver a higher shock? Well, it's because you're an evil person. No, that's probably not the case. There are a lot of other factors, right? And other things that you can do to try to increase someone's aggressiveness to get them to hold the button down longer and select a higher intensity level, right? So that's what the bus aggression model does. One of the problems with the bus aggression model is it doesn't really let you respond to what the other person's doing, right? You're simply selecting an intensity level and you're delivering that, right? There's really no feedback from that other person, okay? There's no reason why, why should you be delivering a shock at all, right? Did this person, cut you off in the parking lot? No, then there's not really any connection there. The other thing that is a problem with the bus aggression model or machine is that it doesn't allow you the opportunity to do something that's not aggressive. We are forcing you to take an aggressive action. We're forcing you to select and deliver a shock, right? There's no option to not shock. There's no option to give the guy a piece of candy if he gets the right answer, right? There's no opportunity for that. You have to shock. You have to select some intensity level and some duration. To sort of address one of those concerns, there's the what we call the Taylor's competitive reaction time task. Okay, in this we still have a participant and we have a fake sort of fake competitor in another room, right, that they can't see. The idea here is that we're asking you to respond to something as quickly as possible, and whoever responds the slowest is going to get shocked. Right? So if you are the slowest, you will get shocked. Now the problem with this is, who's slower, you or a fake person? Well, there's nobody else there, right? So half the time, the experimenter is going to tell you that you were the slowest, and you're going to get shocked. Okay? And half the time, you're going to be the fastest, and you're going to deliver the shock to the other person, right? And you get to select what that shock intensity is. What they do in this task is they actually have that fake competitor over time increase the intensity of the shock they deliver to you, because you can choose, right? And then you can look and see how quickly does the participant increase their level, their intensity of shock in relation to the shock coming from the other fake participant.
So that they get to know if they can feel it, but
yeah,
tell you that it's increased by something.
Well, I mean, they probably couldn't go like, I think that was 8.5 millivolts more, but they could tell that over time that the intensity was increasing. So that's something that you do need to make it clear to them, because you want to sort of tell if they're changing, they're responding in relation to that. So that's called the Taylor's competitive reaction time task. Now, it did not address the issue of giving you the option to not deliver an aggressive behavior, right? Even though half the time you were the winner, you didn't have the option when you were, half the time you were the loser, you didn't have the option when you were the winner to not shock the other person, right? I guess if you were really just a nice guy and a pacifist, you would just never touch the button, right? And just let the timer run out and then lose every time intentionally, but I don't think they were allowed to do that. So to think about ways to cheat at the task. So it still did not address the issue of giving you the opportunity to choose to do a non-aggressive behavior, right? So what we're doing with both of these cases, we're setting the floor pretty high, right? Because there's no way to go down. You're delivering a shock. That's where you are. We're not giving you the option not to deliver a shock. They're getting shocked, and it's because of you. So we're already putting you up here. You can go higher as you increase intensity, but you can't go lower, right? So we're not giving you any kind of floor. That's basically saying that if you show up for the final exam, you're getting a 50%, right? And then everything you do on the exam above that adds to 50%. Who's going to fail the test then? Well, nobody, right? Because if you show up, you've got a 50%, right? And so most of you are going to get at least another 10% out of that, right, to get a 60, and you're going to go from there. So we don't know what the floor is, right? And if we don't know what the floor is, then that doesn't really give us a lot of information, right? So there is another model called the point subtraction aggression paradigm, abbreviated PSAP. I'm going to write that down for you. So with this model, again, we're using a fake participant. We got a real participant, we got a fake participant. You have a computer screen, and there are some amount of money appears on that screen, right? And you can do things to earn money, and you can do things to lose money, and you can do things to take money away from that fake participant, right? Okay? And so in this particular case, what you would do instead of delivering a shock, you would take $2, for example, from that other person if they got a wrong answer. Let's say you both started out with $10, right? And let's say you take $2 from that person. Okay, we take $2, and they lose $2, right? And so that's that aggressive thing. Now, one of the things to keep in mind is that the other participant is also taking money from you, right? So they're gonna, and then you might think about, well, if they took $5 from me this time, I'm going to take $6 from them next time, right? Just to show them, and you kind of think about how this goes back and forth. The sort of nuance that the point subtraction aggression paradigm adds is that you have the option not to take money, right? You don't have to take money from the other person if they get a wrong answer. You're not really getting that money, right? And so in these cases, so you could just say, I'm not going to take the money. That could help you protect your money. That could prevent you from committing an aggressive act, and so you sort of have that that approach. That gives us a better baseline because we've taken the floor and we've moved it down, right? You can take a bunch of money from somebody, but you can also choose not to. So we're giving you that non-aggressive sort of approach as well, okay? So these are sort of the standard, in the lab sort of approaches to test human aggression. Any particular questions about these? You can use these for a whole host of things, right? It doesn't have to be today. We're going to talk about these in relation to drugs, but you could use this in terms of, what if you stole from somebody? What if you embarrassed somebody before they came into the table? What if you called somebody a name, right? That would be something you could do. Maybe you can have the one of the Confederates, who's like signing in participants, kind of mumble a nasty name under their breath as somebody signs in, like, I bet you're a dummy, and then see if that changes how aggressive they are in the. There you go, right? That's a study, Emily. You can do that one. Questions? Great. All right, so do drugs make you more aggressive? Of course they do, except for when they don't. So I know that didn't really tell you anything, right? First, we really have to ask one is, did the drug use come first or the aggressive behavior, right? And that's sort of an important thing to consider. There are comorbidity issues, right? Are you guys familiar with comorbidity? Basically, that's when two things happen at the same time, right? How many of you are interested in clinical work? All right, well, you should just get the word comorbidity tattooed on your forearm, right? That's going to be a great one.
You flash it at your patients like
comorbidity.
Comorbidity.
That's it right there. Also a great name for a death metal band. Comorbidity. It is, right? We can have the bus aggression machine opening up for comorbidity. It's a great summer tour. I'll just get you guys all lined up. This can play all the great venues. Oh, nobody's excited about that. So comorbidity is when you have other things going on, right? There seems to be a high incidence of comorbidity in individuals who have used drugs. Because of that, you have to think about are the other issues that are going on, are those causing some aggressive behavior, right? Okay. If so, how do we pull that out, right? And Zach, this is why we have trouble with that human study kind of stuff, right? Rats, I don't have to worry about comorbidity, okay? I just give them whatever I say they need to have, right? If I want to make a rat depressed, I make a rat depressed. If I want to make it anxious, I make it anxious. If I want to make it nice and happy, I can make it nice and happy, right? I have control on that. I can't do that with people, right? It'd be nice if I could, I guess, right? Just have complete power over everyone's emotions. No comments, huh? That's fine. So, comorbidity is a real concern with any kind of study, right? The other thing is context really matters in these cases, right? One of the things, and we're going to talk about specific drugs here in a few moments, and we're going to talk about how they have effects, sometimes going in different directions. What are they doing? We'll talk about some interesting things related to that. But one of the things to take in mind is context really matters, right? Like when you take the drug, what you're doing with the drug, what you would find if you were to kind of read, and there are a couple nice chapters in the back of your book if you're really interested in these nuances. One of them is about like this thick, right? Which is like almost, it seems like it's almost your whole book. But what they do is they've gone through and they've kind of summarized all of the major studies using a particular drug, whatever that drug is, and animal studies for that drug. What's amazing is that there are differences in doses. High doses of some drugs increase aggression, but the low doses decrease. For some drugs, it's the other way around, right? It depends on the way the drug's delivered sometimes. It depends on the state of the individual who's taking the drug, right? It can have different effects on different individuals. I mean, this is something that we've talked about hierarchy, right? We've talked about that alcohol, for example, is something that alcohol is one of the few straightforward stories, right? When it comes to drugs and aggression, alcohol increases aggression. That's about as close to a guarantee as I'm going to give you on any kind of drug and it having an effect on aggression, even cocaine. And I hate to go ahead and spoil it. I know, right? I know, right? Some cocaine reduces aggressive behavior. I know you wouldn't imagine that, but it does. Again, it's context, it's dosage, it's the individual person, right? There are conditions. So, but alcohol seems to increase aggression across the board. What's interesting is the amount that would increase aggression, right? And so there was a study a number of years ago with monkeys. Aspen, you've probably heard about this. We talked about this in physio. They had dominant monkeys and subordinate monkeys. Some of them had alcohol, some of them didn't, and they looked at this situation in the breeding season and in the non-breeding season, right? And sort of what they found is that alcohol, caused an increase in aggressive behavior sort of across all conditions. But in particular, the increase in aggression was most profound in the dominant monkeys during the breeding season, right? Which is really kind of interesting. You would see the subordinate monkeys have a bigger increase in aggression, still not more aggressive than dominant monkeys, but they would have a bigger increase with alcohol in the non-breeding season, right? Which would be interesting because those dominant monkeys are less interested in the female monkeys. That would actually be a fairly safe time for the subordinate monkeys to try to make a move, although that move would not result in another monkey. So it's kind of a wasted move in some sense. But there you go. That's monkeys and drinking and breeding season, right? Kind of an interesting story there. And I think really the other important thing to keep in mind as you're reading, these chapters and you read, well, if you use this set of conditions, the rats were less aggressive. If I use this set of conditions, the rats were more aggressive, right? And it goes back and forth. Is that, again, we have different types of aggression, okay? We already talked about territory. We talked about mates. We talked about food. We talked about offspring. Okay? Because there are different types of aggression, and each of these types of aggression is activated and controlled by a different neural circuit, it only makes sense that drugs are going to have different effects on these circuits, right? Depending on the context. If you set up a situation where we're looking at territorial defense, then different doses of different drugs are going to cause different outcomes. And I know that's not really giving you any kind of like concrete information about this, right? It kind of feels like it's all just sort of out there. But that's unfortunately where the state of everything is. If you wanted to sort of look at all of the fine-grained details on this, I think it would really just bog you down too much, right? Because it's just this and this, and then this is different, and that's different. Even, and here's a really surprising one too, Alexis, is it's not just cocaine. Anabolic steroids, in fact, don't always increase aggressive behavior. You would think they would because they would increase testosterone, right? And that's kind of downstream result. But there are ways that you can set up the paradigms and you can administer different types of anabolic steroids that might actually decrease the aggressive behavior in the animals that receive those anabolic steroids. Again, that's not something you would anticipate, but it's all about context. It's all about the type of aggression that you're actually triggering, right? And so you would you just want to keep that in mind as we think about these specific drugs, right? And the different things you would have to do to increase sort of aggressive behavior in drugs. And I think this is important because other than Alexis, how many of you thought cocaine was definitely going to always increase your aggressive behaviors? Yeah, I think most people, right? I mean that's pretty standard. The real problem with that is then we have a less than complete understanding about something, right? And when we try to go out and we try to address a problem, we may be addressing a problem that doesn't even exist, right? And I think particularly when we're looking at drugs that individuals might abuse, there is a bunch of sort of myth out there about that, right? Things that people have just heard. Unfortunately, that gets repeated by even people who are in very sort of prominent and well-seen positions They'll repeat opinions about things that aren't entirely accurate, because that's what people like to hear and they like to digest, right? So being very careful not to go into a certain particular critique of an individual who made a comment recently that I was like, oh, please don't say that, but you did anyway. So there you go, right, Emily? You know what I'm talking about.
I probably don't, but
You don't?
they crap like that all the time. So.
Yeah, yeah. It was related to marijuana being a gateway drug.
Oh no, I know exactly.
Yeah, yeah. Now you know where now you know where I am. I was like, please don't go there. We don't want anybody to go there right now. That does not, based on all the evidence available, seem to be the case, right? At all, right? That's not to say individuals don't do marijuana and then they sometimes do other things. That happens.
I saw a really good tweet that was like, well, I know lots of people that got hooked on heroin while being in jail for marijuana. I was like, I feel like that's pretty accurate, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's just, yeah. But it's an easy story, right? I mean, it's an easy story that cuts to the emotional heart of the matter, right? And we do that a lot. We do that a lot with aggressive behavior in general. And I think just what I try to get you to do is like cut just a little bit deeper on what your thinking is on this and really go like, is that what we really know or not? I don't want you to raise your hands, but how many of you know someone who uses marijuana regularly but they don't use any other drugs, right? Yeah, you don't have to raise, it's not you, right? It's all somebody else, I'm quite certain. So that's the case. But there are a number of people, right? And so that doesn't, you know, whatever. There's my soapbox for the day. But I don't want to be too hard on some people who, right? Because the other thing is like, have we done our due diligence going out and debunking these myths? Probably not, right? And it doesn't help sometimes the individuals who go out and try to do the debunking, right? They don't always. I mean, you know, sometimes you gotta play the game and think about appearances, right? So, Zach.
With the legalization of psilocybin in Colorado,
Yeah.
Have they done like more human research into that yet?
So that's a really interesting sort of thing to think about, right? So I want to be careful what I say here. Drugs in that class, right, are a unique set of drugs, right? And the reason they are is because they work on the serotonergic system. They don't really work on the dopaminergic system at all. That's why LSD, right? It's essentially the same drug, you know, for our purposes. If you're really interested, you should sign up for this class next semester called psychopharmacology. Yeah, the guy who's teaching it's great. That was not a joke to laugh at. That was the one time you shouldn't have laughed at a joke. I'm going to keep that in mind. I'm also your advisor. I have so much power over your academic career. You should be careful.
Well, I already tanked it myself, so you can't do any worse.
Great.
She's got a point.
Great. So I am teaching a psychopharmacology class next semester. It's a special topics. Huh?
That's a plug.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, you're asking about this kind of stuff, and this is what we'll talk about in more detail there.
Okay.
But when you talk about those drugs, most of the individuals who have been have used these hallucinogens or psychedelics, and even calling them something like that's a little tricky. I like to call them serotonergics, right? Because that's the system they work on. So folks who use these drugs, they typically stop because they get bored with it. They don't stop because it's causing them other health problems. They typically don't stop because it's something that is controlling their life. They're just like, man, that was awesome, like swimming through that pool of color last night, but I don't know if I want to do that again. I'll try something else, you know, like let me just try something different, right? I'm bored with it. So it's not typically, I'm not saying there aren't negative effects of these drugs, right? Because there's some persistent hallucinations you can have. There are some other, obviously whatever you're doing physically while you're on the drugs can be quite dangerous, right? If you're disconnected from your reality and you're trying to move about your reality, and there are things in your reality that can cause you harm, or you can cause someone else harm, then that's probably a bad idea, right? So those there are definite concerns there, but it's a different kind of thing. There was a good chunk of research on drugs in humans, and that was sort of kind of all drugs in humans for a period of time. But then, sort of in the 60s, there was a little bit of a backlash to that, right? And again, I think this was again, when we think about appearances. I'm not saying like you should definitely definitely go and wear like the 3-piece suit and tie and clean shaven and try to advocate for things. Just be who you are. That's cool, right? But sometimes being who you are, other people they don't respond well to that. And when those people are the people in power, then you don't always get what you need, right? Sometimes you have to think about how you're framing a particular issue, and you got to kind of trick people into giving you what you want, right? And I hate to say that, but if you think about the social movements that have been successful, the way those social movements have been framed has been brilliant. It wasn't necessarily framed around this is the right thing to do. It was framed around other things, and that's why it saw success when it saw success, because those were things that probably should have happened at any other time, right? And they just kind of saw success at that time. The right set of people came along, and they kind of framed something the right way. There was a set of people in the 60s who probably weren't framing things in a way that the sort of straight-laced folks were ready for, and there was like a lot of federal funding got pulled for this stuff, right? And the studies looking at particularly the serotonergics in humans out the window, because there's some evidence, in fact, that you can use these serotonergics for therapeutic approaches, right? And so we're kind of coming around to that now. There are some groups that are doing this kind of work. I don't want to ruin the whole story, but if you're willing to hang in there and take that psychopharm class, you'll get to hear a great podcast about this. I'll tell you briefly. It was this story. It was in Boston. They were doing they got some folks from the seminary. They got like 20 guys from the seminary, right? And so they were these young guys. They sent them to a Good Friday church service. Okay, half of them, they gave them magic mushrooms. The other half gave him a vehicle. They put him in the basement, and they had this famous minister, I don't know what his name was, and he's like booming this voice at them, like, and it's being like piped into the basement of this church, right, while they're doing this church service, and it's all about, whatever church things there are, right, that's what's going on. I've listened to the podcast like 5 times, and I couldn't tell you what he said. I wouldn't pay attention to that part. So anyway, so it's like booming this stuff down in there, right, Tyler? And there are these like 20 guys sitting there, and like half of them are having these like weird experiences, and the one guy who they interview, he talks about like he like died, and then he like came back to life, and then there was like this color wheel in front of him, and he had to pick which color to swim through, and he's like, so I had to decide where to swim through, and he's like, I swam through one of them, and then all of a sudden I came out of it, and he said, when I went home, my wife looked at me and she was like, what happened to you? Like, you're completely different now. And he was like, it was this really life-changing event for him. What's really interesting about that, I mean, that was done in the 60s. What's interesting about that is of the 10 individuals who received the drug, 9 of those went into the ministry. Of the individuals who did not receive the drug, none of those went into the ministry. I know, right? See, that's the interesting part about it. Let's take this a step further just briefly, since you asked. One of the other main sort of effects of these serotonergics is some sort of interaction with a godlike being, right? That's like what a lot of folks say. That's why a number of these drugs are actually used in sort of non-Christian religions, right? We typically think a lot of these like South American religions, Native American religions, we use these. That's why certain drugs are actually legal for certain groups of individuals if they use that within their religious service, right, and they belong to those particular groups. There have been 0 cases of those individuals becoming addicted or overdosing to those drugs over the course that we've been kind of monitoring that, which is sort of interesting. You always like, you got to watch LSD, that's bad for you. Well, I guess. I'm not saying it's good for you, but it's got a different mechanism than some of the other drugs, right? And so that's an important thing to keep in mind. Not an easy story to sell out there in the public, but there it is. Mason?
Yeah, and it's coming back around too. I mean, there's even a television show right now called Kentucky Hiawatha,
Mm-hmm.
where they go through these huts and stuff and take Hiawatha, try to cure themselves or do whatever.
Yeah, I think
Television.
so while I would say, like, I definitely want to know more about how this stuff works, right? Because I'm just like a curious guy. And it affects your brain and how your brain works, and I think that's important things to know. There's also this part of me that's like, it's a little scary sometimes, just like a dude in a hut going like, man, take this. And it's, I was like, what was it? Gronk the other day, you guys know, Gronkowski, right? Who said he cured his CTE somehow. Did we talk about that in this class? Maybe we did, maybe we didn't. I don't know. It's like the big CBD oil thing, right? Like everybody's like, oh man, I got a, high blood pressure. I'm just going to take a bath in CBD oil. I'm going to be fine, right? I mean, we don't know. I honestly think that is not going to work. But we don't know, Mason. I mean, that's the problem, right? Then you get a bunch of people out there doing who knows what with stuff. And that's dangerous, right? It really is, because you don't know what's going to happen. I mean, you can have some serious side effects of this. Some serious things can happen. I mean, we had a group of folks a few years ago who thought like, hey, what's better than marijuana is like synthetic marijuana, right? No, that's a lot worse. That's a lot worse than regular marijuana, because you don't get some of the other chemicals in there to like keep you from having a psychotic break. So this is what happens when we think we know something and we didn't really bother to check it first, right? You end up with people running up and down the street naked screaming about stuff. And I don't think anybody wants that, right? That's not what anybody wants. So yeah, I would like to see a lot more academic research about it. That's me, right? Before we're just like throwing this stuff out there and people are like, yeah,
Who signs up to be contested?
Yeah, so it happens. So there's actually a group of folks in, I think there's a group of folks at Harvard who are doing this, and they bring in adults and they give, yeah. I mean, now I think you have to say like, I'm of a certain age. I think you probably have to admit to being a drug user in the past or having used a substance in the past. I don't, sometimes they may bring in some first time folks, but they'll have you, this was project, again, you'll hear it on the podcast, because I know you're going to sign up for this now, right? They give these serotonergics to individuals, kind of have them just lie down in the middle of a dark room, and then they'll just describe their experiences to them and talk to them about it. So it's kind of interesting. Most of the folks come out and there aren't any problems. They actually turn out quite well. There was one guy who used it to quit smoking, which was kind of an interesting story. He was like, I just imagined the cigarettes disappearing, and I got up and I was like, I'm not going to smoke anymore, and he didn't. So I don't think that's like going to work for everybody, because we don't really know how it worked for that guy, right? Like, what were the conditions and the context of that individual going in and that being his experience? We don't know. We would know if we could get some money to research that. I think there's value in it, right? Because right now we're giving people drugs to treat problems that they have that have a whole host of side effects, right? That are kind of dangerous. And if we can find better ways to do that, then we should, right? Why should we ignore an entire group of things just because, somebody gave it a bad name once, right? Let's study that in a very rigorous scientific way.
It doesn't take a long time. Like, maybe go and see somebody who researched the drug. They did the drug. It helped, but it did something else, like the side effect.
That's, yeah.
The same thing happened to everybody who else used it. It take a long time to come to that conclusion.
It would, but they bring other new drugs to market all the time, right? They squirt them in some rats. Rats live for a month or so. They're like, fine, we'll squirt it in some people. We'll see what happens, right? Just because it's doesn't have a therapeutic sort of label right now. I mean, people. I'm not advocating for rolling around in CBD oil to cure all your problems. I just want to be clear about that, right? I mean, let's actually do things that have evidence behind them. right? And then there's always the placebo effect, which is like a major concern anytime you do something, right? Yeah. That was a good question, though. I'm sorry, that was a little bit of a tangent answer, but yeah, I just really like to, with all of this stuff, I really like to get you guys to just think about things. Don't just accept like the story that's out there because that's what, you know, so-and-so said so, you know? I mean, that's, you know, common knowledge is not often accurate, or not always accurate, right? Sometimes it's wrong. Sometimes it's right. I'm not saying it is always wrong. Got to check it out. All right, let's think about some specific drugs, right? What they might do, what they might not do. So again, alcohol is really the only drug that has a clear positive correlation with aggressive behavior. But even alcohol has some kind of nuance to it, right? And one of those nuances is that there's some sort of dose-dependent sort of issue here with the increase in aggressive behavior. And in fact, some people, you know, their behavior doesn't really change much at all, and then some people, their behavior changes quite a bit while they're using alcohol, right? Why is that, right? I mean, again, this gets back to individual differences, right? Some people have brain circuits are slightly different. Some people have different enzymatic activities. Some people have, you know, a variety of things can be going on that would make things be different for some individuals under even under the same drug, same amount of drug, same amount of alcohol in this case. Marijuana, on the other hand, sort of, you know, the connection there between aggressive behavior and marijuana is not as clear. It does seem that withdrawal definitely seems to increase aggression, at least during the first week of withdrawal from marijuana use, right? That probably makes a little sense, right? I mean, if you think about most of the, you know, if you're thinking about more of a low sort of normal dose of marijuana, that's typically going to reduce aggression. As you get into higher doses, you do have some instances of increased aggression. That's also where you run into some of the more sort of paranoid side effects, right? Some of the other things that might be going on there. If you keep it down in that regular range, you tend to have reduced aggression. Because your aggression is going to be reduced once you stop taking it. You know, during withdrawal, you're going to have a little bit of rebound there. So that's kind of an interesting thing to keep in mind. For tobacco products, typically nicotine deprivation increases aggression, right? I don't know if any of you use tobacco products. One, I'd recommend you stop. And two, I would you know, have you think about the time you did try to quit, which has probably been more than once, and how wonderful of a person you were during the few days while you attempted that, right? Which is probably even the people who at first were telling you, you know, you should probably quit, were like, hey, why don't you try that again? You know, you got to get through that rough patch. This brings up like a whole, so I made this a couple years ago before, and so I'm just going to put nicotine here. Because tobacco, and now it should also include those sort of aerosol products, right? Vaping. That's an issue. I'm really surprised they still have sort of flavor. I mean, I'm surprised they got the flavored vaping products in the first place, right? Because a number of years ago, the government banned flavored tobaccos. There used to be a lot of flavored tobaccos out there, right? You could buy products that were flavored. They only have one flavor. Well, they have two flavors of tobacco now. Anybody know what those are?
Like regular and menthol.
That's it, right? Yeah. Oh, is that what it is?
I think so.
Who knows?
There's full and light.
Oh, whatever.
Work at a gas station.
You work at a gas station, so you know
I
it.
would think that I learned all of this, yeah, unfortunately.
Yeah, there you go.
I mean, they have swishers too, which are technically cigarillos, but that's not what they're usually used for. But those are all flavored.
Yeah. Well, there you go. Thanks for that information.
I also use sort of a gas station.
Sure. It seems reasonable.
It's really interesting because they put the age limit for marijuana buying as 21, but yet they have like candy, gummies, chocolate, like literally everything you could possibly market to a kid.
Yeah, I know, right? And so that's problematic too. So while I'm probably for the most part, I would say, well, here's what I would say: criminalizing drugs has not really worked. So let's try something else, right? If it hasn't worked, try something else. Now, that's not like, I'm not the guy who's like, let's just pass out marijuana to everybody. That probably doesn't seem like the right approach either, right? But I do think there are some interesting sort of things when you think about this, particularly when you think about alcohol and you think about tobacco, and then you think about, marijuana and how we think about all of these sort of things differently, right? But you're absolutely right. I mean, the stuff marketed for kids, I mean, it clearly is. I mean, right? I mean, like if you're an adult and you're taking gummy bears, I mean, I like gummy bears as much as anybody else, but I mean, yeah, be an adult, right? And that does have the potential to get kids, but that was, yeah, that was sort of interesting. So I don't know. Yeah, it's a problem, right? And we don't need little kids on marijuana. That's something I know we don't need. Like I'm pretty clear on that one. I got that one figured out. But it's interesting when you think about the flavors of tobacco, menthol being the only sort of flavor that didn't get banned in the ban of flavors from the government. Anybody have an idea why?
Old lady lobbies?
No. In fact, it was not. But menthol is primarily purchased by minorities. And so the tobacco companies didn't want to lose out on those sales. So they convinced the government to let them continue to market and sell that. It makes a lot of sense, yeah. It's actually a guy across the street, who does like nicotine addiction research with mice and like aerosol nicotine, and it's kind of interesting. I talked to him for quite a bit about this. Yeah, I know, right? Things you don't think about. So yeah, vaping, I wouldn't do that. Just as a heads up, I have a very off-the-record sort of comment about what it's like doing, which I would probably not want to make on a recording. Huh? Oh, the mic's here. I guess I could pause it briefly. And tell you, I just don't think it's a good idea, because the technology inside of those things is like a soldering iron. It's the same technology in a soldering iron. So, I mean, if you're willing to like suck on a soldering iron, I guess have at it. If you're not, I'd just try something else. So there's that. That's a fun thought, right? Yeah. I don't know. What about opiates? Anybody heard of those? I mean, that was almost a joke, right? Codeine actually will increase aggression, like moderate doses of codeine.
Yep.
Yeah.
They prescribe cough syrup with codeine in it, and that's one of the warnings that's on the label when we pass it out to patients. It's like, hey,
you might punch somebody.
Your kid might get jittery.
Yeah. So that's a concern.
Sudafed does it too.
Yeah. That's kind of interesting, right? I mean, there you go. A lot of people have taken codeine before, right? I mean, that's fairly common. Like you said, cough syrup has a lot of cough syrups have codeine in it. So they may actually have an increase. A lot of opiates will. Part of the problem with this is that some of the aggressive behavior might be geared toward obtaining resources to get a substance, right, rather than the cause of the substance itself, and that could actually be particular what's going on with opiates there. When it comes to CNS stimulants, they will most often cause aggression, but some low doses of cocaine can actually cause some decreases in aggressive behavior. So So there's that. That's not me advocating for like microdosing of cocaine. Just want to be clear. Right? Negative side effects on most of these drugs are pretty clear. Part of the concern, I mean, with drugs too, is the method of delivery, right? Can create a set of secondary concerns, right? I think that was the argument for vaping, right? I remember someone, Alexis won't say who, told me that vaping was 95% safer than smoking, and I said that's like saying, you know, shooting yourself in the legs 95% safer than shooting yourself in the face. It's still a bad idea. And so that's my my sort of spin on that. So in case you want my opinion about that, you didn't ask for it, but you're here. You have to listen to it anyway. So don't use that argument, right?
And it's really not either, because it's it's aerosolized oil.
Yeah.
And at least tobacco is like dry. You're like essentially dousing your lungs constantly in liquid, which makes them grow things. Which is mostly the problem that we're having now.
Yeah, yeah. Which you know, we would have known if we tested this first. Instead of just assuming like, I'm gonna cram a soldering iron down in some liquid nicotine and see what happens. I bet people will pay for it. Just think, why didn't I have that idea? I got a soldering iron at home. I try to think of the next craze, right? No? Yeah. I mean, it's almost like a repeat, right? Because I remember like seeing these ads for doctors who were like, oh, you should smoke cigarettes. It smooths a sore throat. Right before it gives you throat cancer. We just don't know. I mean, I don't know. Always be skeptical, right? That's what I'm trying to tell you out there, folks. Always be skeptical. Check things out. Do the research. Do not bother going to the third page of Google. That's not where you get good information. Go to reputable sources, right? Check stuff out. See what we know. If we don't know something, be leery of it, right? Should we talk about some more interesting stuff? Maybe we should. Let's see. What is about tryptophan depletion, right? So there are ways that you can deplete your tryptophan. What's tryptophan good for? It's good for making serotonin, is really what it's good for, right? You can have special diets that are lacking in tryptophan that will deplete your tryptophan, right, and kind of get your serotonin levels wiped out. Kind of interesting. SSRIs, for example, you could take SSRIs. Those will actually increase serotonin, so it's going to decrease your aggression. Again, we've talked about serotonin a lot. You know, odds are there's going to be another serotonin question somewhere between now and the end of the semester, which the only opportunity for me to do that would be on the final exam. Great job. Great job. What about lithium? You guys know what lithium, that's for bipolar, right? It's kind of the standard classical approach. How does lithium work? Well, who knows? That's the honest answer. They give it, I know, right? Like, you're making this face like I'm making this up, but that's the honest truth. They don't know how lithium works. It basically works on every neurotransmitter system you have. It just changes things in some direction, and people seem to be better. So we'll just keep giving it to you. There are some serious dietary restrictions on lithium. There are some serious side effects to be concerned about. But lithium will reduce your aggression, okay, in a non-sedative fashion, right? Non-sedative fashion. You can give folks antipsychotics. This is something you would give somebody to treat.
All kinds of things.
Yeah, all kinds of things.
I've seen them prescribed for autism, bipolar disorder, traditional, any kind of psychosis.
Yeah, schizophrenia is kind of the number one at the top you'd give somebody an antipsychotic for, but it'll also kind of short-term reduce aggression, but not good for the long term. We can skip over beta-adrenergics, and we should talk about benzodiazepines, though, for a bit, right? So benzodiazepines would typically cause a major reduction in aggression, right? These are things that will knock you down. They are great for the 30 seconds you're having a complete freak out. They are not great for anything beyond about 30 seconds, right? You shouldn't take a benzodiazepine longer than it takes to swallow the pill, right? Unfortunately, I say this because unfortunately there are people who have been on benzodiazepines for decades, and that's horrible. That's just a bad idea from the start. A benzodiazepine it's that's not the analogy I want to use. There was an analogy I wanted to use, but it's not appropriate, so I'm just going to skip it. There are better ways to handle these issues. Benzodiazepines are a great way in an emergency situation, right? When you need to sort of quickly knock things down for the safety of the individual and those around that individual. But they're not a good long-term strategy at all. However, benzodiazepines may actually increase aggression in some folks, which I know, right, Tyler? It's like do you want to take that chance that you're gonna give somebody a benzodiazepine, they're gonna be more aggressive? I don't know. You just made a face that was kind of like, oh, that doesn't
I
sound
was
good.
just fighting a sneeze.
Oh, well, let it out. It's fine. You don't have to fight sneezes. Oh, I'm just going to give you the opportunity to do that. So benzodiazepines kind of do that. Why? I'm going to be honest with you. We don't know. Okay, we don't know. It's the same reason why. How many of you have taken like NyQuil? Anybody take NyQuil? Yeah, people take NyQuil, right? How many of you does that make you sleepy? Yeah, how many of it does it? Yeah, right, Zach. Yeah, some people it doesn't work, does it? And you can just sit there and drink the whole bottle, and I'm like, I'm ready. Let's go run a marathon. I don't know, right? Huh? Yeah.
I take like ZQuil when I'm sick, and it doesn't do anything for me. It makes me stay up longer.
Well, you know, what's fancy about that is it's just liquid Benadryl, so you could save some money and just buy some Benadryl.
Or just not do anything if it doesn't work. Yeah.
That's fair too.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, if you're ever in a pinch, like you want to take some ZQuil, just go buy some like generic brand Benadryl, works the same.
Yeah. So there's sometimes some folks that Benadryl will actually make you more hyperactive than less. There are a number of genetic things, right? And I think we're getting better. This is one of the things to think about. We're getting better at genetic panels, and they're getting cheaper, right? They're getting much cheaper than they used to be, and they can actually reveal some information about how your body is going to process particular drugs, right? There are panels they will give individuals now that look at your serotonin transporter, right, and see if you actually have a functional serotonin transporter or not. Because if you don't have a functional serotonin transporter, an SSRI is probably not going to do a lot for you, right? Because your serotonin transporter is not really working anyway. Blocking it's not going to make a difference, right? Because it's broken as it is. If you have an overactive serotonin transporter, well then maybe you can do something with that. But if it's underactive to begin with, taking an SSRI is just going to give you side effects. It's not going to give you any bonus on the effect you're going for, right? And so I think as we start to do more and more genetic testing, we start to figure this out more in individuals, we'll start to get to hopefully some more individualized approaches to treating these sort of issues, more individualized approaches to understanding why some individuals can take a drug and increase aggression, why some take a drug and they decrease aggression, right? Why does this happen for individuals? And I don't know. I think that's a really exciting place that we're going, right? There are companies now that, you know, they'll do a panel for you for maybe $300 or something. And I know that sounds like a lot, especially from like a student perspective. And you're like, I go to the free clinic even if my arm's about to fall off, and just like let them tape it back on because they don't have any other money. But $300 to get a panel, you know, to get some lab work done to figure out like, hey, I got a busted serotonin transporter anyway. That can actually save you a lot of time and effort and prevent you from having some negative side effects. Anybody know like side effects of SSRIs?
Dizziness, drowsiness, weight gain, general apathy.
Yeah.
Not good things.
Suicidal tendencies too,
Yeah. All of those are great if you have depression, by the way. Those are surefire. Those are surefire ways to get you right out of it, which is really a problem, right? I mean, like let's give somebody an SSRI because they're depressed, and then let's have them gain a bunch of weight. Let's let them be dizzy and apathetic and suicidal. Really done a lot of good for that person, right? Maybe if we had invested a couple $100 on the front end and we said, hey, SSRIs aren't going to work for you. Let's try something else. Yeah, so that's the other thing with these panels. If you have an overactive set of enzymes, for example, that are going to break down a drug, then you need to increase the drug. Some people are fast metabolizers. Some people are slow metabolizers. How many of you know someone who takes any kind of drug, even if it's like an Advil, and it just wears off in 5 minutes, right? Or somebody who can like smell the Dayquil and they're asleep for half a day. No, my wife is like that. Like if she looks at a Dayquil, I like it like the non-drowsy, and she falls asleep. She can't take the regular stuff because she'd sleep for like 2 days. Some people metabolize things at different paces, right? And that makes a big difference on how that drug affects you and how long it affects you and whether or not it actually has time. If you're taking a drug, one of these drugs, and you're metabolizing that very quickly, then it probably doesn't have time to make you aggressive, right? But if it hangs around and it gets in, it does a few other things. When I was in graduate school, we used a particular species of animal called tree shrews. That's not terribly important that you know what those are. They're like small squirrel chipmunk things from Southeast Asia that have some really interesting features about them. We would use, in like a lot of veterinary situations, we would use ketamine as an anesthetic. The problem is they would burn ketamine off really fast. They had a really high metabolism. We always joked there was no such thing as a fat tree shrew. If you thought it was fat, it was pregnant, because they had no body fat at all. I mean, they were very lean, and their digestive system was very straight. So, I mean, there were curves in it, but not like what you would see in like a human. Bunch of curves. You get food in there, it stays a while and it moves around. Stuff that went in it was like in and out, and which was not a lot of fun. You can imagine why. But we would have to give them ketamine injections like every 15 minutes to keep them anesthetized during a procedure that we were doing, because we would need to keep doing that. And we used that in conjunction with some other anesthetics, but they would really burn that anesthetic off very quickly. If we were to give a human an equivalent dose of ketamine that we would give one of these animals, I mean, they would be out for a while, right? I mean, you'd be feeling the effects for some extended period of time. But these animals, they would just burn it off because they had a different set of liver enzymes, right? Their liver enzymes were a bit hyperactive compared to what you would anticipate in a human, which was kind of fascinating. There's actually another species of tree shrews called the pintail tree shrew. That's a nocturnal species. What's really interesting about that is they eat this fruit that's fermented, right? And so what they do is they sort of eat the fruit and then use the flour as a toilet, because again, things come in and they come right out almost, right? And so and then they help kind of fertilize the whole process. But the fruit they eat has fermented, right? And they ingest almost like what would be the equivalent of like a 10 times the dose that a human would need to sort of feel the effects of alcohol and have some motor effects. And they have no motor effects at all. So they really like metabolize the alcohol very quickly, and they don't they can't get drunk. So they just keep like eating this fermented, alcoholic fruit. And actually, all ripe fruit probably has some small bit of alcohol in it, in case you're curious. You didn't know that. You should think about these things, right? That's probably why like beer is so tasty to people, and like other alcohol, like why do humans in general like to drink alcohol, right? And it's related to fruit. All sort of fruit has a bit of, now the percentage is extremely low, right, compared to like a glass of wine or something, right? I did that like a mug instead of a glass, right? It was like a glass of wine. It's not really a wine drinker, so is that better?
Sure.
Okay. So it's probably related to that small percentage of alcohol in ripe fruit that you kind of crave, right? Not a real problem when the highest concentration of alcohol you could get was from a ripe apple. It's probably not so bad, right? But when you can get it from like some other beverage, then it can start to pose some problems. So that's interesting, right? It's kind of things to think about. Other questions? I would anticipate being able to think about these different sort of approaches to testing aggression in the lab, right? And I would think about like how would you use one of these approaches to test aggression, right? Like if somebody were to say to you like, I'm really interested in knowing what's the effect of calling someone a big dummy on their aggressive behavior, how might you design that study? Well, you could say, I'm going to use the bus aggression machine. When people sign in, under my breath, I'm going to call them a big dummy, and then I'm going to measure their sort of, intensity and duration of the shock compared to people that when they come in, I'm going to say, whoa, that's a really nice pair of shoes. So there you go, right? You got your two conditions. You got a control and you got a experimental condition. You've got a particular model that you're going to use, right? You can use it using the PSAP. Right? That's kind of a fun one. You could say, oh, well, maybe people who have compliments about their shoes are less likely to take money from someone else. Maybe they're more likely because they want to go buy more shoes. I don't know, right? So anyway, I would think if I was going to be you and I was going to be trying to get ready for the final exam, I would be thinking about how I would use one of these models to test aggression and be able to justify why I would pick that model, right, over someone else's approach. And there are advantages and disadvantages to each of them. You might not need to go through the elaborate setup of the point subtraction aggression paradigm. If you're just asking a quick question, and maybe something else is appropriate, right? Okay, maybe one of these better fits, the way you think about that particular aggressive behavior. I would also think about sort of broad concepts when it comes to drugs and whether or not they make you more or less aggressive, okay? I probably would not spend a lot of time thinking about what specific drugs do, largely because I said specific drugs do just about everything, right? They do increases and they do decreases. The only one where I said there was sort of a clear example, like a clear sort of relationship, was with alcohol. The more alcohol you drink, the more aggressive you are. And that's pretty well across the board, right? There's not much variation there. I mean, there's variation in how aggressive someone is, but not whether or not they're aggressive.
But after time, doesn't alcohol turn into a sedative?
So yes, there is a point where you can drink so much you black out, yes. And even at lower doses, and that's why you have to kind of get past that initial low dose, but at those lower doses there's even some. The weird thing about alcohol is it's sort of a U-shaped relationship on whether it's a sedative or sort of like I don't want to say a stimulant, that's really the wrong word, but at the lower doses and at the very high doses, then yeah, you would see some. But in the middle there, you're going to see, for the vast majority of the spread of the doses of alcohol, you're going to see a dose-dependent relationship. As you increase, you're going to see an increase in aggression. While I'm probably not going to ask you specifics about animal models or approaches to studying animal aggression, I would be prepared to talk to me about what are important factors to consider when you're thinking about, is an animal going to be, what are some of the non-experimental factors, right? So if we're looking at the effects of drugs, what are the other things we need to think about that could affect the aggressive behavior of a particular animal, right? Some of those are going to be about that particular animal. Was it isolated? Was it not isolated? Is it a male? Is it a female, right? Some of those factors are going to be related to the other mouse that's going to be involved in that particular study, right? Did it have strong pheromones or not? Did it have its gonads or not, right? It's an important question. Everybody's writing that one down. Sometimes I wonder what kind of notes you guys take from these lectures.
Bad.
Bad ones.
A lot of mine are just quotes of things that you say.
Really?
Yeah.
I can't write and pay attention at the same time.
Yeah, that's why I typically record the lectures, right? So you guys can sort of decompress this later.
I think earlier today I wrote down, I gave Rasco cake once.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I did it more than once.
Write that down too.
Yeah, that's in there.
Yeah. I made the mistake once in my, the last time I taught psychopharmacology, Zach, I said to my class, you know, when I used to buy drugs, and what I meant was, when I worked in a research lab and we had to purchase drugs from a scientific supplier and have a DEA license to do so, that was the real sentence that I should have said. And I simply said, yeah, back when I used to buy drugs, you know, we did this differently. Yeah, it wasn't exactly what I meant. But we did have a DEA license. Actually, when I was in graduate school, we had the DEA show up once because we used, again, we had ketamine, controlled substance. We also had sodium pentobarbital, which is it's a drug for euthanasia. Typically, is what you would use that for animals. So we were not a lab that was known to come in early in the day, which worked great for me, right? If you were in at 10 a.m., you were the first person in the lab. So we all rolled in between 10:30 and 11. We got in. There was a guy sitting outside. The lab was locked. There was a guy sitting outside the lab waiting with a badge. He was from the DEA because they do random checks, right, for people who have a DEA license, and we had one. We actually had 2 DEA licenses because we had like 2 locations. And he came in and went through like all of our books, checked the dose, like how much drug do you currently have? Can you account for how you've used all of it? If you haven't, you know, what are the fines? So we had actually been working on, we'd actually been working at 2 different locations. And so I would take ketamine from one location to the other while I was riding the public bus. Looking back, I realized that was not the best idea I ever had. So I would, I would have jars of like, rat brains in one pocket and ketamine in the other. So people weren't going to mess with me. I mean, you pull out a jar of formaldehyde with a rat brain and people back away from that. Right, so I thought I was safe. But the guy said, like, from the DA was like, hey, we could probably send you guys to jail for like a decade for doing it. We'd accounted for all the drug that we had transported, and we thought, well, there's a DEA license here, there's a DEA license here, we're good to go. And he's like, no, you got to transfer this stuff, and so like if you're doing this, then you've got to write. I was like, ah. So basically it was I just had to like, from then on I had to take not only the ketamine but the book that I wrote down the ketamine stuff in instead of like transferring it to the other lab. Anyway, the guy kind of laughed and let us go, because thankfully we had extremely good records of all the ketamine that we'd used. So, yeah, the DEA, they mean business. Yeah, and he'd been sitting there since like 8:30 in the morning, waiting on us to come to work. Thankfully he was in a good mood. So that's a fun story. Back when I used to buy drugs, that's how things went. Actually, we got some drug once that was not any good. We got something that was like the batch was bad, and it didn't work to anesthetize our animals. We had to send it back. So we had to send back. It wasn't the ketamine. It was this other like drug that we used. Didn't put the guys down. So we sent it back, and they tested it, and they're like, yeah, it doesn't have the right potency. So they like sent us some more. I know. Yeah, it was kind of a weird situation, but it happens. So, all right, other questions? That's sort of all the new content I had today, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you guys have. No one has any questions? I'll just sit here. I mean, not indefinitely, but I'll sit here for a while. I can draw. I know, right? I can draw more awesome babies, right? Where's the clear? There it is.
Moving forward into research on humans,
Yeah.
do you think that it is possible to reach an end goal with a strictly behavioralist approach, or do you think that there have to be new concepts and language to describe the effects that are happening to the people?
Jeez. Man, that's a good one.